At 1:20 p.m., the phones went off. Active shooter, Tumbler Ridge Secondary School. In a town of roughly 2,400 people, that alert meant one thing: someone you know is inside. Classroom doors were locked. Students moved desks against walls. Teachers counted heads. Parents began driving toward the school before they knew where to go. By the end of the afternoon, 8 people were dead. More than 24 others were injured. 6 of the dead were inside the school. 2 were found at a nearby residence. The suspect was 18 years old. Police later confirmed there had been prior contact at the residence. Firearms had been seized, then returned. What happened that afternoon is known. What happened before is still being examined. Tumbler Ridge sits in northeastern British Columbia, surrounded by forest, mining roads, and long stretches of highway that separate it from larger cities. It is a town of roughly 2,400 people, small enough that teachers know siblings, neighbors recognize vehicles by sound, and high school sporting events bring much of the community together. Life there moves at a steady pace. February 10th began like any other Tuesday. At Tumbler Ridge Secondary School, students were transitioning between classes shortly after noon. Backpacks lined the hallways. Locker doors opened and closed. The routine rhythm of an ordinary school day was in motion. Nothing in the morning had signaled that anything was about to change. At nearly the same time, emergency calls began coming in from a residence elsewhere in town. Reports of gunfire. Inside that home were 39-year-old Jennifer Jacobs and her 11-year-old son, Emmett. Both would later be confirmed dead. The shooting had started there, not at the school. What happened next unfolded quickly. The shooter left the residence and drove to Tumbler Ridge Secondary. In a town this size, that drive takes only minutes. There was no long pursuit across highways, and no cross-city search. The movement from home to school was immediate and local. Inside the school, students initially mistook the sound of gunfire for something routine. A locker slamming, something dropped on the floor. It took seconds for the confusion to turn into fear. Police have stated that shots were fired in a stairwell and inside the library. Teachers began locking classroom doors. Lights were turned off. Students were told to get low, stay quiet, and silence their phones. One 17-year-old student later described hiding in a gym storage area for nearly 3 hours. He did not know whether the shooter was still in the building. He did not know how many people had been hurt. He only knew that something catastrophic was unfolding in the place where he attended class every day. The RCMP responded rapidly. Officers entered the school while the situation was still active. Police have stated that the suspect fired at responding officers before ultimately turning the gun on himself inside the building. The violence lasted minutes. The uncertainty lasted much longer. When it ended, 6 people inside the school were dead, 5 students and 1 teacher. 27 others were injured. The suspect, 18-year-old Jesse Van Rootselaar, was also dead. For those inside the school, the day fractured into a before and an after. But for investigators and for families, the timeline began earlier, at a house just minutes away. In the immediate aftermath of a mass shooting, information arrives in fragments. Authorities confirm casualty counts. News outlets repeat numbers. But in a town the size of Tumbler Ridge, numbers do not remain abstract for long. They resolve into names, and those names are tied to families who have lived in the same streets, attended the same schools, and shared the same community spaces for years. Kylie Mae Smith was 12 years old. Her family described her publicly as kind, bright, and deeply loved. In messages shared online, relatives said their world crumbled when they learned she had been killed. At 12, her life was structured around school days, friendships, and the small milestones that define early adolescence. Her name quickly moved from police statements into memorial posts written by people who had watched her grow up. Abel Mwansa was also 12. His father wrote that Abel loved school so much that when homeschooling was once mentioned, he cried at the thought of being separated from his classmates. On the morning of February 10th, Abel left home for school like any other weekday. He had plans later that evening to attend church youth activities. His father later wrote that instead of picking him up after class, he received a call telling him his son had been shot. He described Abel as respectful, hard-working, and focused on his studies. Zoe Benoit, 12, was remembered by community members as warm and outgoing. In a small northern town, children often grow up in the same classrooms year after year. Friendships overlap with sports teams, birthday parties, and family connections. Her loss was felt not only by classmates, but by the wider network of families who had known her for years. Tikaria Lampert, 12, was described by friends as energetic and full of life. At that age, the world still feels local, defined by school corridors, weekend activities, and time spent with friends. Her classmates are now navigating grief in the same building where they once shared ordinary routines. Ezekiel Schofield was 13 years old. His grandfather wrote publicly that the tears just keep flowing. He described Ezekiel as an amazing child who always had a smile. Ezekiel played hockey in the Tumbler Ridge Minor League Association, a central part of community life. In towns like this, hockey schedules structure entire winters. Teammates become extended family. In the days following the shooting, the arena, normally filled with noise and movement, became another place where loss was discussed quietly. Shanda Aviugana Durand was 39 years old. She was an educator at Tumbler Ridge Secondary School. In communities this size, teachers are woven into daily life beyond the classroom. They teach siblings across years. They attend local events. They know parents personally. Her death was not only the loss of a staff member, but the loss of someone who had been part of the school's structure and continuity. All 5 student victims were between 12 and 13 years old, grades typically marking the transition from childhood into early adolescence. Their lockers remained, their desks remained. Backpacks were left where they had been placed earlier that day. One of the students who survived was 12-year-old Maya Gabala. According to reporting from CBC and other outlets, Maya was shot in the head and neck while attempting to lock the library door. Her parents later said she was trying to protect classmates. She was airlifted to BC Children's Hospital in Vancouver in critical condition. Doctors initially feared she would not survive. In the days that followed, her family reported small signs of improvement: independent breaths, eye movement, enough that she was moved from end-of-life care back into intensive treatment. A fundraising campaign was launched to support her long-term medical care. Days later, hundreds gathered at a vigil in Tumbler Ridge. The venue, normally used for routine community gatherings, was filled beyond capacity. Candles were lit. Names were read aloud. Prime Minister Mark Carney attended and spoke about grace in the face of violence. Premier David Eby praised the actions of school staff and assured students they would not be required to return to the same building. The local school district superintendent later confirmed that alternative arrangements were being developed. In a city, loss can sometimes feel dispersed. In Tumbler Ridge, it is concentrated. Nearly every person in town is directly or indirectly connected to one of these names. But for one family, the tragedy did not begin at the school. It began at home. Before the lockdown alerts, before parents began driving toward the school, before national leaders arrived in town, there was a house. The first emergency calls on February 10th were not from inside Tumbler Ridge Secondary. They were from a residence elsewhere in the community. Investigators have stated that the shooting began there before the suspect traveled to the school. Inside that home were 39-year-old Jennifer Jacobs and her 11-year-old son, Emmett. Both were killed in the residence. Their bodies were discovered as part of the initial emergency response, before officers shifted focus to the unfolding situation at the school. In the days that followed, police tape remained around the property as investigators processed the scene. Neighbors described watching forensic officers move in and out of a house that had been part of the street for years, an ordinary home now marked as the starting point of a mass casualty event. Confusion spread quickly in the aftermath about names and relationships. Public records and family statements clarified that Jennifer had previously used the surname Strang. The suspect's legal surname was Van Rootselaar, from his father. Online speculation blurred those details, forcing relatives to correct misinformation while still processing their own grief. Emmett's biological father, Jean-Pierre Jacobs, later released a public statement. He described his pain as unbearable. He wrote, "I lost my little boy, a man's pride and joy." He clarified that he was not the father of the shooter, despite social media claims suggesting otherwise. He explained that he had been estranged from the children for approximately 8 years and had tried at times to remain involved. In that same statement, he described Jesse as a troubled child and said he had no idea things had deteriorated to this point. The RCMP confirmed that Jesse was a biological male who had begun transitioning approximately 6 years earlier and publicly identified as female. Investigators have not established a motive, and they have stated that some aspects of the case may never be fully known. What they have confirmed is procedural. Police had attended that residence multiple times over the past several years. Jesse had previously been apprehended under British Columbia's Mental Health Act. Approximately 2 years before the shooting, firearms were seized from the home. At a later point, those firearms were returned to a lawful owner. The police have not publicly specified which individual in the residence held legal ownership, nor have they detailed the conditions attached to that return. Police have also confirmed that the suspect's firearms license had expired at the time of the shooting. These facts do not explain the motive, but they establish that February 10th did not emerge from a vacuum. The house had a history, and that history is now central to the investigation. By the time the shooting ended, questions were already forming, not necessarily about motive, that may never be fully known, but about prior contact. Deputy Commissioner Dwayne McDonald of the RCMP confirmed in multiple briefings that police had attended the suspect's home several times over the past few years. Those visits were connected to mental health concerns and firearms-related incidents. At least once, Jesse was apprehended under British Columbia's Mental Health Act. Under that legislation, police can detain someone without a warrant if they believe the person poses a danger to themselves or others. The individual is taken for psychiatric evaluation and may be held for up to 72 hours before release, depending on clinical assessment. Roughly 2 years before the shooting, firearms were seized from the residence. At a later point, those firearms were returned to a lawful owner. The police have not disclosed when that return occurred, who authorized it, or what conditions were attached. That absence of detail has drawn attention. Legal experts interviewed by CTV News have pointed to an uncomfortable procedural question. When firearms are seized in the context of a mental health apprehension, why was a prohibition order not pursued? Or, if it was pursued, why did it not prevent access to guns in the home? Under Canadian law, police can request that a chief firearms officer issue a prohibition preventing someone from possessing or accessing firearms. In cases involving mental health concerns, such orders are not uncommon. The police have confirmed that Jesse had a firearms license, but that it had expired. They have also stated that 3 suspected murder weapons are now under forensic examination: a long gun and a modified rifle recovered at the school, and a shotgun recovered at the home. Police have acknowledged they do not yet know the origin of 2 of those firearms. When asked directly whether a weapons prohibition had ever been imposed on Jesse, police responded that those details form part of the ongoing investigation and may be subject to legal privacy constraints. That answer, while legally standard, has not satisfied everyone. Ottawa defense lawyer Michael Spratt told CTV that transparency is critical in cases involving firearm seizures and returns. Without documentation, he said, the public cannot assess whether procedural mistakes were made. Other firearm law specialists have noted that returning seized firearms after a mental health incident typically involves conditions: secure storage requirements, restricted access, or, in some cases, relocation of weapons outside the home. Whether such conditions were imposed here has not been publicly disclosed. None of this alters what happened inside the school, but it does frame the larger question now facing investigators. When police intervene in a home because of mental health and firearms concerns, what safeguards exist? And were they enough? This is not a question about the frontline officers who responded to the school. It is a question about process, and process is where prevention either succeeds or fails. 3 days after the shooting, hundreds gathered in Tumbler Ridge. The town's population is roughly 2,400 people, and that evening it felt as though most of them were standing together in the cold. Candles lined the snow, floral memorials covered sections of fencing near the school. Parents stood shoulder to shoulder, some with arms folded tightly against the February air, others holding children who did not want to let go. Students clung to one another. Some wore hockey jerseys in honor of Ezekiel Schofield. Others carried handwritten signs bearing the names of classmates and teachers. National leaders traveled north to attend. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood among the mourners. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was there as well. Governor General Mary Simon was there. In his remarks, Carney acknowledged that nothing he could say would ease the pain of the families gathered before him. Instead, he spoke about grace. He said that in moments like this, a community can choose how it responds. It can choose bitterness, or it can choose grace. What he said he saw in Tumbler Ridge was grace. Neighbors supporting neighbors, teachers shielding students, families comforting one another. The word was deliberate, not political, moral. At the same time, British Columbia Premier David Eby addressed students directly. He told them they would not be forced to return to the current high school site. Plans for alternative schooling arrangements would be shared in the coming week. For many families, the physical building had already become inseparable from what happened inside it. Classrooms were no longer neutral spaces. Hallways carried memory. Beyond the town, the national conversation widened. Some called for stricter firearm controls. Others pointed to gaps in mental health intervention and follow-up. Still others focused on how law enforcement categorizes and communicates identity in high-profile cases. The police had confirmed that Jesse was a biological male who began transitioning approximately 6 years earlier and publicly identified as female. Police officials used female pronouns in briefings, in accordance with federal policy regarding gender identity. That choice became part of a broader national discussion, not about the victims, but about language, law, and classification. At the center of all of it, however, remained the same reality. 8 people were dead, 27 others were injured, and a town of 2,400 people was trying to decide how to move forward. The vigil did not answer procedural questions. It did not resolve debates about firearms or mental health law, but it marked a turning point. The moment when Tumbler Ridge stopped being only a crime scene and became a community in mourning. By the time candles were lit at the vigil, the outcome was already fixed. 8 people were dead, 27 others were injured. The suspect had died inside the school. Those facts will not change. What remains unsettled, and likely will for some time, is everything that came before. The police have confirmed that officers attended the residence multiple times over the past several years. They have confirmed that Jesse was previously apprehended under British Columbia's Mental Health Act. They have confirmed that firearms were seized from the home approximately 2 years prior to the shooting, and later returned to a lawful owner. They have also confirmed that the suspect's firearms license had expired at the time of the attack. 3 suspected murder weapons, a long gun, a modified rifle, and a shotgun, are now under forensic examination. Investigators have stated they are still working to determine the origin of 2 of those firearms. Those are the confirmed facts. What has not been confirmed is motive. What has not been publicly clarified is whether a prohibition order was ever pursued to prevent access to firearms following the earlier seizure. What has not yet been disclosed is what specific conditions, if any, were attached when the firearms were returned to the home. And so, the question now sitting at the center of this case is not only why this happened, it is whether there was a point at which it could have been interrupted. British Columbia's Mental Health Act permits police to detain an individual for psychiatric evaluation if they are believed to pose a danger to themselves or others. But that detention is temporary. After clinical assessment, release can follow, sometimes within 72 hours. Firearms can be seized when public safety concerns arise, but those seizures must be documented, justified, and processed through legal channels. In certain circumstances, firearms can be returned to their lawful owner. Intervention in Canada operates within legal thresholds. Police cannot detain someone indefinitely without court authority. They cannot permanently confiscate property without due process. They cannot restrict rights beyond what legislation permits. These safeguards are intentional. They exist to prevent overreach. But When an event like this unfolds, those same safeguards come under scrutiny. Legal experts have argued that transparency surrounding the earlier firearm seizure and return will be critical. Without documentation of what steps were taken or not taken, the public cannot assess whether proper procedures were followed, whether risk assessments were sufficient, or whether additional safeguards might have changed the outcome. This is not an accusation against the frontline officers who responded to the school and moved toward danger. It is a broader examination of process, of how systems function before crisis becomes catastrophe. Because prevention, if it exists at all, does not occur in the final moments of violence. It occurs earlier, in assessments, in paperwork, in court applications, in decisions that are procedural and quiet and rarely make headlines, until something goes wrong. The investigation will continue. Some answers may emerge, others may remain protected by privacy law or lost to incomplete records. What remains for Tumbler Ridge, and for the country watching, is the uneasy space between intervention and inevitability, and whether that space in this case was wide enough to stop what happened on February 10th. There will be investigations, there will be reviews, there will be questions asked about policy, procedure, and prevention in the weeks ahead. Those conversations matter, but tonight, this is still a story about 8 people who are gone, about families who are sitting in quiet houses, about classmates who will remember a hallway, a stairwell, a classroom for the rest of their lives. Tumbler Ridge will keep going. It has to. Small towns always do. But it will never be February 9th again. That's where we leave it. Before we get into analysis, we want to say this clearly. Our hearts are with the families who lost loved ones, with the injured, with the students and staff who survived, and with everyone in Tumbler Ridge living through the aftermath of February 10th. A town that small doesn't just witness something like this. It absorbs it.
And if you're listening from Tumbler Ridge or you have family there, we're not here to turn your loss into content. We're going to stay grounded in what's been confirmed, and we're going to be careful about what we don't know.
Exactly. And tonight, the thing we want to focus on is the part of this case that keeps resurfacing in official updates and legal commentary, prior contact, not the moment of the shooting, but what happened before it.
Because when people hear the police had already been there, it changes how they process everything. It creates a different kind of grief. The grief you can't stop replaying. The what-if loop.
Let's lay out what's confirmed, just as anchors. The police confirmed multiple prior attendances at the residence over the years. They confirmed a Mental Health Act apprehension. They confirmed firearms were seized about 2 years ago and later returned to a lawful owner. They confirmed the suspect's firearms license had expired. And they confirmed investigators are now focused on 3 suspected murder weapons, including a shotgun at the residence that had not previously been seized.
And that's where people start asking the question you can hear between the lines of those updates. How does a house get to guns seized and then get to guns returned and still end in a mass shooting?
Right. This is where we need to be fair and precise. It's easy to turn that into a simple accusation. Someone messed up. But the reality is, the system has layers, legal thresholds, competing rights, limited powers, and sometimes limited resources, especially in a remote community.
But there's also a real accountability question. If firearms are seized in a mental health context, what are the safeguards that are supposed to follow? Were conditions imposed? Was storage required off-site? Was a prohibition order sought? If it wasn't, why not? If it was, what happened?
The CTV reporting raised that exact point. Prohibition orders exist as a tool, and legal experts pointed to a transparency problem. In cases involving seizure and return, there's usually a process that leaves some kind of record, and the public wants to know what happened in this case.
And the RCMP's response, that some details may be restricted because of law or ongoing processes, that might be true. But it doesn't satisfy a community that just buried children.
This is where I think people misplace blame sometimes. There are frontline officers responding in real time, and then there's the institutional layer, policies, procedures, approvals, court processes, administrative decisions. If you're asking, is this an RCMP failure, The honest answer is the incident response and the pre-incident system are different questions.
And the prior contact question is mostly about the pre-incident system.
Exactly. The uncomfortable truth is that intervention is not a single action. It's a chain, and chains break at the weakest link, or they break because the link legally can't hold.
So let's talk about the intervention angle you want to emphasize. When people immediately go to more gun control, what you're saying is, this case looks like an intervention breakdown, more than a pure access to gun story.
That's my view, yes, with an asterisk. Canada will debate gun policy, and that's inevitable. But what makes this case different is prior contact plus seizure and return. If guns can be seized and returned in a mental health context, then the prevention question becomes, what triggers a long-term restriction? What triggers off-site storage? What triggers a prohibition order? What triggers follow-up?
And what triggers resources being deployed? Because interventionist policy isn't just a legal power, it's people and capacity.
Right? Rural reality matters. If a person is apprehended under mental health legislation, that's not the same as long-term treatment. It can be stabilization, it can be assessment, it can be release. And if follow-up care isn't available or is delayed, that's not just a personal issue, and it becomes a public safety issue in edge cases.
This is where the national comparisons come in. You asked earlier about Dawson College and the Montreal Massacre. People often try to find a single explanatory variable, or a one cause, but these events are usually multi-factor.
On the question you asked, was mental health an issue in those cases? In broad terms, there were discussions around mental state in both, but the contexts are not identical, and you can't paste one onto another. What you can say is that after major mass casualty attacks, societies often re-examine warning signs, intervention thresholds, and whether institutions could have acted sooner.
And that's the safe connection. Not they're all the same, but they all force the same type of questions.
Agreed. And then there's another thing people forget. The public often learns details out of order. Early reporting is chaotic. Names change, descriptions change, and that creates a vacuum where speculation rushes in.
We had to change our script so many times over the week to get to this final copy, and even then, we still don't have everything if you included rumors and opinion pieces online, which brings us to the identity debate because it's already part of the public discourse.
Yes. The police confirmed the suspect was born male and had begun transitioning years earlier, and identified publicly as female. Police used the legal name in releases. Some outlets and commentators focused heavily on pronouns, categorization, and whether sex-based risk factors are being obscured.
The important line for listeners is this: investigators have not said gender identity was a motive factor. That's not where the confirmed facts lead right now.
Right. And we can acknowledge the debate without turning it into a verdict. The debate has two main claims people are making. One side says, sex matters statistically in violent crime analysis, so institutions should not blur sex categories when assessing risk and prevention. The other side says, respecting gender identity is standard policy, and language choices don't explain violence, and should not be used to imply causation without evidence.
And for us, the correct framing is, it's a live debate in Canada, but it's separate from motive unless investigators establish a link.
That's spot on. If someone wants to argue policy, that belongs in policy spaces. In a true crime episode, we keep it tied to what's confirmed and what it affects operationally, record keeping, risk assessment models, and public communication, not as a substitute explanation.
There's also the digital footprint reporting. City News reported violent digital content believed to be linked to the suspect's accounts, including a reported shooting simulation set in a virtual environment. That's being treated as part of a digital footprint, but the police has not publicly confirmed that material as motive evidence.
And that distinction matters, because digital content can be meaningful, but it can also be misinterpreted, misattributed, or used to build narratives that outrun facts. The responsible stance is, investigators are looking at it. We don't yet know what it means.
So if you're trying to land the episode on an intervention thesis, the clean through line is prior contact, seizure, return, expired license, unclear prohibition status, and the rural capacity question.
And one more thing. People want a single villain. If it's not the shooter, then it becomes the police. But the more honest approach is to ask, was this a frontline failure or a system design problem? Because a frontline officer can respond perfectly inside the powers they have, and the system can still fail upstream.
And that's why transparency matters, not to punish somebody for the sake of punishment, but to understand what the system actually did and what it could do differently next time.
Very true. The best outcome of an investigation like this is not just closure, it's clarity. Who made which decisions, under what authority, with what constraints, with what safeguards, and whether those safeguards are strong enough.
And for the families, the only thing worse than grief is unanswered process questions that never get resolved.
That's where we'll leave it for now. We'll keep updating this as the police releases more verified information, and we'll stay disciplined about separating confirmed facts from speculation. The families of Tumbler Ridge deserve that.
Before we sign off, if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please consider following the show and leaving a review. It genuinely helps more people find these stories. And thank you to the 550 of you who've subscribed to us on YouTube. We see you, and we appreciate you.
And to the families and survivors, we're truly sorry for your loss. We're thinking of you. See you next Monday. Until then, take care of each other.